All the Young Dudes. Chapter 1. Summer, 1971, St. Edmunds. Saturday, 7th of August, 1971. He woke up in the dark. It was too hot in the little room they'd put him in, being early August. Though he supposed that could be the fever. He always had a high temperature the morning after. They used to put him in a room with a window, but a few months ago he'd been able to smash one of them, and if it hadn't had bars anyway, then he'd have escaped. He'd heard them talking about restraining him as he got older. He tried not to think about it. He remembered the feeling of hunger, so intense it transformed into rage. He remembered howling and kneeing for hours, circling the ceiling over and over again. Perhaps they'd let him off today's lessons, and he could sleep. It was the summer holidays anyway, and not fair that he had to do lessons when the other boys were allowed to spend all day dossing about, playing football or watching telly. Sitting up, he stretched carefully, paying attention to every ache and pop of his joints. There was a fresh claw mark behind his left ear, and a deep bite in his right thigh. He rubbed his hand over his scalp, where his hair was shaved very close to his head and bristled against his fingers. He hated it, but every boy at the children's home had the same severe buzz cut. It meant that when they were allowed out in town on weekends, everyone knew they were St. Edmunds boys. Which was probably the point. The shopkeepers knew who to look out for. Not that the boys themselves did anything to subvert expectations. They had been told so often that they were the dregs of society, left behind and unwanted. So why not cause a little havoc? Remus heard footsteps at the end of the hall. It was Matron. He could smell her, hear her heartbeat. His senses were always amplified after one of his episodes. He stood up, pulling a blanket around himself despite the heat, and padded towards the door to listen harder. She was not alone. There was a man with her. He smelled old and somehow different. A thick iron scent which reminded Remus vaguely of his father. It was magic. "Are you sure it's worth your time?" Matron was asking the stranger. "He's really one of our worst cases." "Oh yes," the old man replied. His voice was rich and warm like chocolate. "We're very sure. Is this where you keep him during his episodes?" the matron finished in her clipped nasal voice. "For his own safety. He started biting since his last birthday." "I see," the man replied, sounding thoughtful rather than concerned. "May I ask, madam, what is it you know about the young man's affliction?" "Everything I need to know," Matron replied coldly. "He's been here since he was 5, and he's always been trouble. Not just because he's one of your sort." "My sort?" the man replied, calm and unperturbed. Matron lowered her voice, almost to a whisper, but Remus could still hear. "My brother was one. Haven't seen him in years, of course, but he occasionally asks me for favours. St. Edmunds is a very special institution. We're equipped for problem cases." Remus heard the jangle of keys. "Now, you must let me see him first. He often needs patching up. I don't know why you wanted to see him after a full moon in the first place if you already knew." The old man did not reply, and Matron walked towards Remus's door, her patent leather heels clicking on the stone floor. She knocked on the door 3 times. "Lupin, are you awake?" "Yeah," he replied, pulling his blanket tighter. They took his clothes off him to stop them getting torn. "Yes, Matron," Matron corrected him through the door. "Yes, Matron," Remus muttered, as the key turned in the lock and creaked open. The door was plain wood, and he knew he could easily smash it during an episode, but it had been fitted with silver plating after the window incident. Just the smell of it made him feel queasy and headachy. The door opened. Light poured in like water, and he blinked wildly. As Matron entered the room, he automatically took a step back. She was a bird-like, pointy sort of woman, with a long, thin nose and dark, beady eyes. She regarded him warily. "Need any bandages this time?" He showed her his wounds. They weren't bleeding anymore. He noticed that the injuries he had inflicted upon himself, though deep, healed faster than any other cuts and scrapes. He never even needed stitches. The scars never faded, however, and left silvery slash marks across his body. Matron knelt before him, dabbing him with antiseptic and wrapping him in itchy gauze. This done, she handed him his clothes as he dressed quickly in front of her. "You've a visitor," she said, finally, as he pulled his t-shirt over his head. It was grey, like all of their clothes. "Who?" he asked, looking her in the eye because he knew she didn't like it. "A teacher. He's here to talk to you about school." "I don't want to," he replied. He hated school. "Tell him to get lost." Matron clipped him around the ear. He'd expected it and didn't flinch. "Less of the lip," she snapped. "You'll do as you're told, or I'll leave you in here for the rest of the day. Come on now." She grabbed his arms and pulled him forward. He scowled, thought about fighting her off, but there was no point. She really might lock him in here again, and he was curious about the stranger now, especially as the scent of magic grew stronger as they moved down the shadowy corridor. The man waiting for them was quite tall and dressed in the strangest suit Remus had ever seen. It was velvet, a deep maroon colour, with elaborate gold embroidery at the cuffs and lapels. His tie was midnight blue. He must have been very old indeed. His hair was white as snow, and he had an incredible long beard which must have reached his navel. Strange as he looked, Remus didn't feel intimidated, as he did with most grown-ups. The man had kind eyes, and smiled at Remus from behind half-moon spectacles as they approached. He extended a hand. "Mr. Lupin," the old man said warmly. "A pleasure to meet you." Remus stared, entranced. No one had ever addressed him with such respect before. He felt almost embarrassed. He shook the man's hand, feeling an electric burn as he did so, like battery acid. "Hi," he replied, staring. "I am Professor Dumbledore. I wonder if you would join me in a turn about the grounds. It's such a lovely day out." Remus glanced up at Matron, who nodded. This in itself was worth having to talk about school with an oddly dressed stranger. She never let him outside during a full moon, not even with supervision. They carried on down a few more corridors, just the two of them. Remus was sure he'd never seen Dumbledore at St. Edmund's before, but he certainly seemed to know his way around. Once they were finally outside, Remus breathed deeply, the warm summer sunlight washing over him. The grounds, as Dumbledore had called them, were not extensive. A patch of yellowing grass the boys used for football, and a small patio terrace with weeds growing up through the cracks in the crazy paving. "How are you feeling, Mr. Lupin?" the old man asked. Remus shrugged. He felt the same way he always did afterwards, sore and restless. Dumbledore didn't snap at him for insolence, merely continued to smile down at him as they walked slowly around the perimeter fence. "What do you want?" Remus finally asked, kicking a stone out of his way. "I suspect you already have some idea," Dumbledore replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a brown paper bag. Remus could smell sherbet lemon, and sure enough, Dumbledore offered him a sweet. He took it and sucked. "You're magic," he said plainly. "Like my dad." "Do you remember your father, Remus?" He shrugged again. He didn't very well. All his memory could ever drag up was the shape of a tall, skinny man wearing a long cloak looming over him, crying. He assumed that had been the night he was bitten. He remembered that well enough. "He was magic," Remus said. He could make stuff happen. Mum was normal. Dumbledore smiled at him kindly. Is that what your matron has told you? Some of it. Some of it I knew. He's dead anyway, topped himself. Dumbledore looked slightly taken aback by this, which pleased Remus. It was a point of pride having a tragic backstory. He didn't think about his father often, other than to consider whether he would have killed himself if Remus hadn't been bitten. He carried on. Mum's not dead, though. Just didn't want me. So I'm here. He looked around. Dumbledore had stopped walking. They were at the furthest edge of the grounds now, by the tall back fence. There was a loose board there which no one knew about. Remus could slip through it if he wanted to, and get onto the main road into town. He never really went anywhere in particular, just wandered around, waiting for the police to pick him up and bring him back. It was better than doing nothing. Do you like it here? Dumbledore was asking. Remus snorted. Course I bloody don't. He side-eyed Dumbledore, but didn't get in trouble for swearing. No, I didn't think so, the old man observed. I hear you're something of a troublemaker. Is that right? Ain't any worse than the others, Remus said. We're troubled boys. Yes, I see. Dumbledore stroked his beard as if Remus had said something of extreme significance. Got another sweet? Remus held out a hand expectantly. Dumbledore handed him the bag, and he couldn't believe his luck. The old fool was a complete pushover. He chewed the lozenge this time, feeling it crunch like glass between his teeth, sherbet exploding on his tongue like fireworks. I run a school, you know, the same school your father went to. That threw Remus off. He swallowed the sweet and scratched his head. Dumbledore continued. It's a very special sort of school, for wizards, like me, and like you. Would you like to learn magic, Remus? Remus shook his head fervently. I'm too thick, he said firmly. I won't get in. I'm sure that's not true at all. Ask her. Remus jerked his head back towards the tall grey building where Matron lay in wait. Can't hardly read even. I'm stupid. Dumbledore looked at him for a very long time. You haven't had a very easy start in life, Mr. Lupin, and I'm sorry about that. I knew your father, only a little, and I'm sure he would have wanted... Anyway, I'm here to offer you something different, a place among your own kind, perhaps a way to channel all of this anger you have. Remus stared at him. What difference did it make if he was in one home or another? Matron never gave him sweets, and didn't smell like magic. The kids at Dumbledore's school couldn't be any worse than St. Edmund's boys, and if they were, then at least he could hold his own in a fight now. But there was always a but. What about my episodes? He asked, folding his arms. I'm dangerous, you know. Yes, Remus, I know, Dumbledore replied sadly. He placed a hand on Remus's shoulder, very gently. We'll see what we can come up with. Leave it with me. Remus shook him off and chewed on another sherbet lemon. They walked back to the building in silence, both satisfied that they understood each other now. Chapter 2. First Year, the Hogwarts Express. Remus rubbed his scalp again, then his nose, which kept running. It had been bothering him since dinner the evening before, when another boy had punched him. To be fair, Remus had kicked him first, but the boy, Malcolm White, was 14 and twice the size of 11-year-old Remus. Malcolm had made some crack about Remus going to a special school for backwards kids, and he'd had to retaliate. He had a black eye now, which he regretted. Everyone at the new school would think he was a yob, but then he supposed he was a yob. Matron slapped his hand away from his head, and he scowled up at her. They stood in the huge ticket hall at King's Cross, staring at 2 platform numbers. There was a number 9, then number 10. Matron looked at the letter in her hand again. Oh, for goodness sake, she muttered. We have to run at the barriers, Remus said. I told you. Don't be ridiculous, Matron said. I'm not running at anything. I'll go then. Leave me here. Remus had only half believed Dumbledore when he'd explained how to access platform 9 3/4. But then packages had started arriving for him, delivered by owls and containing strange books and weird clothes and all sorts of oddments like quills and parchments. Dumbledore had been unfailingly generous over the past month. He'd presented Remus with a list of things he would need for his new school, and promised to send him as much of it as he could from the second-hand supplies at Hogwarts. Now Remus was willing to believe almost anything the old man said. He never owned so many possessions before. He was actually glad when Matron had locked everything in her office so that it couldn't get pinched by the other boys. Now it had all been crammed into an old, battered charity shop suitcase, which he had to hold in a very particular way so it didn't fall apart. I'm not leaving you anywhere, Lupin. Just wait there while I find a guard. Matron clipped off towards the ticket office, her big backside wobbling as she went. Remus glanced about furtively, then licked his lips. It might be his only chance. He ran at the barrier at full pelt, squeezing his eyes shut tight as he approached the metal turnstiles. But he didn't hit anything. The atmosphere changed, and he opened his eyes to find himself standing on a completely different platform, surrounded by people. Not people, wizards. The train itself was huge, gorgeous and old-fashioned. The Hogwarts Express. He clutched his suitcase with both hands, biting his lip. There were lots of other children, his own age and older, but they were all with their families, some of them crying as they were hugged and kissed by protective mothers. He felt very small and very alone, and thought it best just to hurry up and get on the train. Inside, he couldn't reach the luggage rack to stow away his things, so he chose an empty carriage and sat the suitcase on the seat beside him. He watched the people on the platform through the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. He wondered if they all came from wizarding families too. He wondered if any of them had episodes like he did. He didn't think so. None of them seemed to have scars. A lot of them were wearing normal clothes, like he was, albeit with fewer holes and patches. But some were wearing long, dark robes and tall, pointed hats. Lots of the other kids had owls or cats carried in baskets. He even saw one girl with a tiny lizard perched on her shoulder. Remus was starting to feel even more nervous, his stomach rolling as he realized that despite everything Dumbledore had said about being among his own kind, he would be just as out of place at Hogwarts as he was everywhere else. Just then, he realized that someone was staring back at him from the platform. It was another boy, his own age. He was tall and slim, but not skinny like Remus. He had dark hair, much longer than any other boy he'd ever seen, curling gracefully to his shoulders. He had fine, high cheekbones, a full mouth, and startling blue eyes. Seeing Remus staring, the other boy arched one perfect eyebrow in a gesture that clearly said, "And what are you looking at?" Remus stuck his tongue under his bottom lip so that his chin bulged, pulling an ugly face. The other boy smirked slightly, then threw up 2 fingers at him. Remus almost laughed. "Sirius, what do you think you are doing? Come here at once." A rather severe-looking witch, with the same angular eyebrows as the boy, stepped into view, yanking her son away from the window. The boy rolled his eyes, but obeyed, and they disappeared further up the platform. Remus sat back in the beaten leather seat and sighed. He was getting hungry. He hoped the journey wasn't too long. Matron had packed him 2 dry cheese pickle sandwiches and had an apple, but he didn't fancy them very much. After a few more minutes, the door to his compartment burst open, and a girl came rushing in. She ignored Remus, flying to the window, pressing her hands against the glass and waving frantically at her family standing on the platform. She was small and pale, with bright red hair pulled back in a tight plait. Her face was blotchy from crying. She kept waving as the train drew away, and her parents waved back, blowing kisses. A sour-faced girl stood beside them, her arms folded. Once the train had completely left the station, the red-haired girl sat down opposite Remus, sighing deeply. She looked at him with huge green eyes glistening with tears. "It's so horrid saying goodbye, isn't it?" She had a high middle-class accent. Yeah, I suppose." Remus nodded, self-conscious. He didn't really like girls. St. Eddie's was single-sex, and the only contact he had with women was the matron and the school nurse, and they were both mean old bitches. The girl was looking at him curiously. "Are you from a Muggle family too? My name's Lily." "Remus," he replied awkwardly. "My dad was a wizard, but I didn't know him. Well, I grew up with Muggles." "I couldn't believe it when I got my letter," she smiled, warmly cheering up. "But I can't wait to see what it's like. Can you?" Remus couldn't think how to answer her, but he didn't have to. The door slid open once more, and a boy poked his head in. He had long black hair, like the boy Remus had pulled faces at, but it was poker straight. He had a long nose and wore a deep frown. "There you are, Lily. I've been looking ages," he said, giving Remus a dirty look, the sort Remus was quite used to. "Sev!" Lily jumped out of her seat and threw her arms around the other boy. "I'm so glad to see you." He patted her shoulder shyly, his cheeks slightly pink. "Come and sit in my carriage. There's plenty of room." "Oh," Lily looked back. "Can Remus come? He's all by himself." "I'm not sure." The other boy, Sev, looked Remus up and down, taking him in piece by piece. The thuggish haircut, the frayed jeans, the worn-out t-shirt, the second-hand suitcase. "There might not be that much room." Remus slouched down in his seat, propping his feet up on the bench opposite. "Get lost then. I don't want to go to your stupid carriage." He looked out the window purposefully. Lily and the other boy left. Remus let his feet drop back onto the floor. He sighed. It was noisy outside his little compartment. He could hear the shrieking and laughter, and owls hooting and a few younger students still crying. Once again, he found himself locked away from everyone else. He was starting to wonder if that was just his lot in life. Once he got to his Hogwarts place, they'd force him to sleep in a cell all by himself too. There was a sudden rap at the door, a short, cheerful tune, and it opened once more. Remus slouched even further down in his seat, as a friendly-faced boy with a mess of dark hair and large round glasses entered, grinning. "Hiya," he held a hand out to Remus. "First year? Me too. I'm James." He nodded his head back to a short boy who had followed him in. "This is Peter." Remus shook James's hand. It felt easy and comfortable. For the first time, the tight coil in his stomach began to unwind. "Remus, can we sit here? Everywhere else is full, and Peter's getting train sick." "I'm not," Peter muttered, taking a seat opposite Remus, eyeing him warily. He did look a bit green. He rubbed his hands together in his lap and stared at the floor. "Know what house you'll be in?" James asked Remus directly. Remus shook his head. He didn't know anything about houses. That where they'd be sleeping? "What were your parents in?" James persisted. "Did they go to Hogwarts?" Remus nodded slowly. "My dad did. I don't know what house, though. My mum didn't. She was a Muggle." Peter looked up suddenly. "You're a half-blood?" Remus shrugged helplessly. "Shut up, Pettigrew," James chastised the boy next to him, as if it even matters. Remus was just about to ask what a half-blood was when the door opened yet again. It was the good-looking boy who'd sworn at him in the station. He glanced about furtively. "None of you are related to me, are you?" he drawled. He had the same high upper-class accent that Peter and James had. Remus disliked them all at once, knowing that they'd think he was common, and a half-blood, whatever that was. "Don't think so," James replied, grinning. "James Potter." He held out a hand again. The other boy shook it easily. "Oh, good, a Potter. Dad told me not to talk to you." He sat down next to Remus, grinning. Sirius Black. Chapter 3. First Year. The Sorting. Remus was fairly sure he was dreaming, or he'd drowned getting over that awful lake, and this was just his brain making things up before he died. He was standing in an enormous stone hall the size of a cathedral. It was full of students, all dressed in identical black robes, apart from their ties, and lit by candles. Not just any candles. These candles were actually floating. He might have been able to live with that. It could have been a clever trick of the light, something to do with the wires. But when he looked up, he almost yelled. There was no ceiling, just the vast night sky hanging above them, pendulous grey clouds and glittering stars. No one else seemed interested, save for the redhead girl, Lily, and a few other kids Remus assumed must have had Muggle parents too. He had on his uniform now, and felt a little better to be dressed the same as everyone else. All of the other students sat on long banquet tables under their house banners. James had excitedly explained the differences between each house, much to the chagrin of Sirius and Peter, both of whom were concerned they'd end up in the wrong place. Remus didn't know whether to be nervous or not. He couldn't see how much it would matter to him. He'd probably get kicked out after his first lesson anyway. The more time Remus spent among other wizards, the more he convinced himself that he couldn't actually be one. Professor McGonagall, a thin, stern-faced witch who had led all of the first years into the hall, was now standing beside a stool, holding a mangy old brown hat. This was the test James had told them about. They had to put on the hat, then somehow they would each be sorted into one of the houses. Remus looked up at each of the banners. He already knew he wouldn't end up in Ravenclaw, not if you had to be clever. He didn't think much of the one with the badger. They weren't exactly exciting animals, especially compared to snakes. He liked the colour green too, if it came down to picking a tie. But then James and Peter had both been keen on Gryffindor, and seeing as they were the only people who'd been very friendly so far, he wouldn't mind going with them. A boy called Simon Arnold was the first to be called forward. The hat was placed on his head, covering the top half of his face. Remus wondered whether it smelled as bad as it looked. Matron was always a maniac about head lice, and he hoped none of the kids who went before him had them. Simon was promptly sorted into Hufflepuff, the Badger House, to tumultuous applause. Sirius Black was the first of their group to go, and he looked positively queasy as he approached the stall. There was some catcalling from the Slytherin table. Some of the older students were calling him out. Two younger women, with masses of dark curls and same high cheekbones and full lips as Sirius, who was now trembling on the stool. The hall was quiet for a few moments as the hat came to rest on Black's head. Then the hat screeched, "Gryffindor!" A few moments of stunned silence before the clapping came this time. McGonagall gently lifted the hat from Sirius's head and gave him a small, rare smile. He looked completely horrified, casting a desperate look at the Slytherin table, where the two girls were heckling him and hissing, eyes narrowed. He got up and walked slowly over to the Gryffindors, where he was the first new student to take his place under the red and gold banners. The sorting continued. Lily was also placed in Gryffindor, and sat grinning next to a very miserable-looking Sirius. When it was finally his turn, Remus still couldn't see what all the fuss was about. He didn't much like having everyone's eyes on him as he pushed to the front, but he did his best to ignore it He would have shoved his hands in his jeans and slouched normally, but in his weird new uniform it wouldn't have had the same effect. He sat on the stool, McGonagall looking down her nose at him. She reminded him a bit of Matron, and disgust rose in his throat. She lowered the hat over his eyes. Everything went dark. It didn't smell at all, and the peace and quiet was actually a bit of a relief. A soft voice spoke in his ear. It was the hat. Remus tried not to cringe as it purred quietly. "You're an odd one, aren't you? What shall we do with you? Perhaps Ravenclaw? There's a good brain in there." Remus flinched, feeling as if someone was playing a joke on him. Not bloody likely. "But then," the hat considered, "you might go further, much further, if we put you in Gryffindor." Remus ripped the hat from his head as soon as it had sorted him, not waiting for McGonagall to remove it. He hurried over to the Gryffindor table, barely registering the cheers and clapping as he passed. He sat opposite Sirius and Lily. Lily shot him a pleased smile, but he just looked at his empty plate. By the time the peas came around, Remus had somewhat recovered and was able to watch with some interest as Peter, a small, pudgy-looking boy, hurried towards the sorting hat. Peter was the sort of boy who wouldn't last 5 minutes at St. Eddie's. He had a perpetually nervous, twitchy look that other boys always singled out. Remus was surprised that James, who was the polar opposite of Peter, relaxed and self-assured, brimming with confidence, was being so kind to someone so obviously inferior. The hat took a very long time over Peter. Even the teachers seemed to be getting nervous as the minutes ticked by. Finally, he was sorted into Gryffindor, and, much more quickly, so was James, who strode over to the table with a huge grin on his face. "How great is that?" he addressed the 3 other boys. "We all made it." Sirius groaned, his head in his arms on the table. "Speak for yourself," he replied, slightly muffled. "My father's going to kill me." "I can't believe it," Peter kept saying, eyes wide. Though he'd clearly got what he wanted. He kept wringing his hands and shooting looks over his shoulder as if someone might come over at any moment and ask him to try again. McGonagall did come over, but she placed a bony hand on Remus's shoulder. "Mr. Lupin," she said quietly, but not so quietly that the other boys couldn't hear. "If you would come to my office after dinner, it's next to the Gryffindor common room. One of the prefects can show you." Remus nodded, mute, and she left. "What was that about?" James asked. "McGonagall wants to see you already?" Even Sirius looked up now, curious. Remus shrugged, as if he didn't care either way. He knew what they were thinking. The rough kid was already in trouble. Sirius was looking at his black eye again. Fortunately, the food had appeared, distracting everyone. And it really had appeared. The previously empty plates were suddenly laden with an actual feast. Golden roasted chickens, piles of crispy roast potatoes, plates of steaming carrots, peas swimming in butter, and an enormous jug of dark, rich gravy. If the food was going to be like this all the time, then Remus wondered if he could ignore talking hats and snobbish housemates. He paid very close attention as one of the Gryffindor prefects, who introduced himself as Frank Longbottom, led the first years to their common room in one of the towers. Remus hated getting lost and tried very hard to cement the journey in his mind as they went. He made a mental note of the size and shape of every door they entered, each portrait they passed, and which staircase moved. He was so tired and full of good food that the moving portraits and staircases no longer seemed out of place. Once they reached the right corridor, Remus saw McGonagall's office, marked with a neat brass plaque, and decided to get the meeting over with. He paused outside the door and was just about to knock when James appeared. "Want us to wait for you, mate?" Why? Remus asked, eyeing the dark-haired boy suspiciously. James shrugged. So you don't end up on your own? Remus stared at him for a moment, before slowly shaking his head. No, I'm fine. He knocked. Enter, a voice came from within. Remus pushed open the door. The office was small, with a neat little fireplace and rows of books up against one wall. McGonagall sat behind an immaculately tidy desk. She smiled thinly and motioned for Remus to sit down in the chair opposite. He did, sniffing and rubbing his nose. I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Lupin, the teacher said in a reedy Scottish accent. Her hair was grey, pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore deep green robes secured with a golden clasp shaped like a lion's head. I'm even more pleased to have you in Gryffindor House, of which I am the head. Remus didn't say anything. Your father was in Ravenclaw, you know. Remus shrugged. McGonagall pursed her lips. I thought it best to speak with you as soon as possible about your condition, she said quietly. Dumbledore has explained that you've had minimal interaction with the wizarding world so far, and I feel it is my duty to let you know that people with your particular problem face a huge amount of stigma. Do you know what stigma means? Remus nodded. He couldn't spell it, but he knew the word well enough. I want you to know that as long as you're in my house, I will not tolerate anyone treating you differently or unkindly. This applies to all of the students under my care. However, she cleared her throat, it may be prudent for you to exercise caution. I wasn't going to tell anyone, Remus replied, as if I'd want anyone knowing. Well, quite. McGonagall nodded, looking at him curiously. That brings me to my next point. Arrangements have been made for the full moon, which next occurs this Saturday, I believe. If you could report to me after dinner, I shall show you where to go. Perhaps you could tell your friends that you're visiting someone at home? Remus snorted. He rubbed the back of his head. Can I go now? The professor nodded, frowning slightly. Outside, Remus found James still standing there, alone, waiting for him. Told you I'd be okay, Remus said, annoyed. James just smiled. Yeah, but you missed Longbottom giving us the password. Didn't want you stuck out here all night. Come on. James led him to the end of the corridor, where hung a large painting of a voluptuous woman wearing pink. Widdershins, James said, and the portrait opened, swinging out like a door. They entered the common room. There had been a rec room at St. Edmund's Boy Reformatory, but it was nothing like this. The room had been sparsely decorated, containing a black and white, too small TV, and a few board games. The decks of cards were always incomplete, and most of the chairs were broken or damaged. The Gryffindor common room was warm, comfortable, and cosy. There were huge, squashy-looking sofas and armchairs, a thick maroon rug in front of the blazing fire, and even more paintings adorning the walls. We're up here, James said, leading Remus to a winding staircase in one corner. At the top, there was another door which opened into a bedroom. Again, this was nothing like the facilities at St. Edmund's. There were 4 beds, all enormous, hung with thick red velvet curtains with gold-trimmed tassels. There was another fireplace, and each boy had a heavy mahogany trunk and a set of shelves by their bed. Remus saw his sad little suitcase propped up against one of the trunks. He moved over, assuming that this was his bed. Peter was rifling through his own things, pulling out clothes and magazines and books, making a terrible mess. I can't find my wand, he wailed. Mum made me pack it so I wouldn't lose it on the train, but it's not here. Pete, James grinned. Your mum asked me to look after it, remember? James and Peter, Remus had learnt since the train, had grown up as neighbours and knew each other quite well. Though two boys couldn't be any more different, and Remus still didn't understand why James didn't want to beat the shit out of Peter. Sirius was sat on his bed, his trunk still packed. "Cheer up, mate," James said, going to sit next to him. "You didn't want to be in Slytherin anyway, did you?" 500 years, Sirius replied stonily. "Every black at Hogwarts has been sorted into Slytherin for 500 years. "Well, it's about time someone tried to be different, huh?" James slapped him on the back jovially. Remus opened his trunk. Inside, there was a large pewter cauldron, another item Dumbledore had scrounged up from the second-hand bin, he imagined. There was also a long, thin box at the bottom, with a note on top. He unfolded the note and stared at the elaborate swirly script for a long time, trying to make sense of it. He only recognised the word father, and guessed that it was also from Dumbledore, but had belonged to his father. Opening it eagerly, he found a long, polished stick. It was a wand. He hadn't thought about wands yet, but he took it in his hand and squeezed the wood firmly. It was warm to the touch, like his own flesh, and felt supple as he turned it in his hands. It felt good. Sirius had finally started to unpack, pulling book after book out of his trunk. Those that didn't fit on his shelves he stacked beside his bed. James stared, having just finished pinning a poster next to his own bed. It showed a lot of little people zooming about on broomsticks, throwing balls to each other. Remus thought it looked only mildly more interesting than football, which he hated. "You know," James said to Sirius, still stacking books, "there is a library here." Sirius smirked. "I know, but these are mostly Muggle books. My Uncle Alfred left them to me, and Mum would set them all on fire if I left them at home." Remus's ears pricked at that. What was wrong with Muggle books? Not that he had any with him. He hated reading more than anything in the world. He didn't think about it for long, though, because now Sirius was lifting an actual record player out of his trunk, followed by a box of brand new looking records in shiny bright sleeves. He went over to look right away. "Is that Abbey Road?" he asked, peering into the box of vinyl. "Yeah," Sirius grinned, handing it to him. Remus wiped his hands carefully on his robes before taking it from him, handling it carefully. "You must be Muggle-born," Sirius said. "Never met a wizard who knows the Beatles. Except my cousin, a Dromadeer. She bought them for me." Remus nodded, forgetting himself for a moment. "I love the Beatles. One of the boys in my room at home's got at least 10 singles, but he never lets me touch them." "Boys at home?" Sirius arched an eyebrow. Remus thought he seemed very grown up. "You mean your brother?" "No," Remus shook his head, handing back the record and shrinking away. "I live in a children's home." "Like an orphanage?" Peter asked, wide-eyed. Remus felt anger rising, his ears growing hot. "No," he spat. He felt all of the boy's eyes slide towards his bruise again and turned around to unpack the rest of his things in silence. Eventually, Potter and Black started up a conversation about something called Quidditch, which soon became a very heated argument. Remus climbed onto his bed and drew back the curtains, relishing the privacy. It was dark, but Remus was used to the dark. "You'd think he'd try harder to make friends," Peter whispered loudly to the other boys. "Especially if he's Muggle-born." "Are you sure the hat wasn't supposed to put you in Slytherin?" Sirius drawled. Peter was quiet after that.